As my wife and I, we got to go to Israel about 2 years ago, and that was kind of one of our confirmation trips. Just went there to see the place. We were on a tour, but after that, it really solidified in my heart that this is where we were supposed to begin to go. One of the things about the Holy Land is seeing the actual geographical locations where many things happen, and I was sometimes astonished that certain things you read about in the Bible are still there. I didn't know they were still there. You know, the ruins, foundations of a couple synagogues that they're pretty much convinced Jesus taught in these synagogues. The foundations of some of these places are still intact. It was really quite remarkable. It really helped bring the scriptures to life. And one of the things that I had heard about a long time ago was a teaching by a guy named Ray Vonderlaan. And he was talking about a cultural thing that they had in the Old Testament and carrying on into the New. And it was this idea of setting up standing stones. Standing stone as a physical object to, in a sense, trigger in their minds a memory of something significant in their history, but for the Israelites, particularly their history and their journey and their walk with God. And so I've been thinking a lot about this message lately, or about that principle, and I'll read a few passages from Scripture where we see this. Every nation, every culture has its memorials. They have their markers, their things that they have historically, which kind of helps give them a common identity. I was thinking about this a little bit during Memorial Day at the beginning of the summer season, of how we remember those who've given their lives on behalf of the nation. Some years ago, I was watching a television program, and the title of it was a 1-hour documentary, and it was just called 1968. And that caught my attention. I watched this program, and they're talking about even the cultural significance, and this program was kind of a memorial to that year. Of course, the people running the program were from like 60 Minutes, and they were hippies during the 60s, and this was their favorite year, so they made a program devoted to this year. But as they're going through this year, talking about the key events, I just want to read some of them for you. Some of the key events that, at least the designers of this television program, they saw this as a turning point in American history, perhaps world history. And they talked about some pop culture things, some political things. But here's some of the things that 1968 was known for that were highlighted during this program. Some very pivotal things, some just kind of incidental. But one was that it was a leap year. Not too big of a deal, but that's what it was. Apollo 8 entered orbit around the moon. So that was kind of a pivotal thing. First time people had gone around circled the moon. Richard Nixon won the presidential election. That was the year that Boeing released the 747, which is still in use today. That was 1968. Also, Hot Wheels toy cars debuted that year, 1968. The first Planet of the Apes movie came out in 1968. So that makes me feel old because I remember watching that when I was a kid. The original Hawaii Five-0 television series began that year. Not the one that's on right now, but the original one. The Civil Rights Act was signed into law by Lyndon Johnson. Those are some of the things that year is known for, but mostly it was seen as a turbulent year. And some negative things happened that year. Being from Minnesota, one of the turbulent things that happened that year was that the Green Bay Packers won the Super Bowl. That was kind of a tragedy for us in Minnesota. Congress repealed the requirement for gold standard to back U.S. currency. And there are some who are saying we still have yet to see the consequences of not having your money have a reference point, not fixed in anything solid. The Vietnam War, of course, was in full effect. There were protests and violence among student radicals at the universities around the country, including bombings and just a lot of turmoil. Czechoslovakia was invaded by the Soviet Union that year. There was the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., which was just a shock for the whole country. The assassination of Bobby Kennedy happened that year. And that's just some of the things they brought up. But as I watched this program, there was one thing that they didn't highlight that to me was very pivotal. It was a very pivotal event for me. And that's the year I was born. Very pivotal for me. And they didn't mention that in this television show. But I recognized as I was thinking about this documentary, talking about key events. They were focused on key events that, in their minds, shifted the culture or turned history in a certain direction. And I was thinking about that in relation to this idea of standing stones, which I mentioned earlier. Oh, thank you, Tom, for putting this water under here. My voice is getting a little dry. I tend to, yeah. It's been difficult the last few days, though. No, just kidding. Oh, my. No. Yeah. But some examples of this biblically, in the Old Testament, if you remember Jacob, after he had left the Promised Land area out of fear of his brother Esau, he went back to his relatives far away. As he was coming back, he set up some standing stones, some rocks as a memorial to that place where heaven opened up, and he saw the angels ascending and descending on the staircase, and he called that place Bethel, house of God. He set up standing stones there as a memorial to this very specific location, which for him was very pivotal in his own journey of trusting God. Okay. You also have incidents where generations later, the children of Israel, as they're coming out of Egypt, they went to Mount Sinai. For them, Mount Sinai was a very important place. This is where God revealed the covenant, revealed the Ten Commandments. They saw the glory of God on the mountain. They built their tabernacle. Well, God had called them to build a memorial, a pile of stones, one stone for each tribe at the base of the mountain, as a memorial that this is a place where God came and met with us as a people. And it was meant to be something that would last for generations. Anyone who would come by would ask, what's going on here? What do these rocks signify? And it would be a way to remind them of that. One passage I want to read, this is actually from Joshua chapter 4. And I want to read this because we see this aspect come in again of the importance of these standing stones. I want to read Joshua chapter 4. I'll read verse 1 through 7. But just to give some context, this is after Joshua had picked up leadership of the nation of Israel. And the Lord had done something very amazing for him. He had parted the waters of the Jordan River so that the whole nation was able to cross through on dry ground into the Promised Land. Well, once they got to the other side, they're now in the Promised Land. That's where we pick up the story in chapter 4. When all the nation had finished passing over the Jordan, the Lord said to Joshua, "Take 12 men from the people, from each tribe a man, and command them, saying, 'Take 12 stones from here out of the midst of the Jordan, from the very place where the priest's feet stood firmly, and bring them over with you and lay them down in the place where you lodge tonight.' Then Joshua called the 12 men from the people of Israel, whom he had appointed, a man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, 'Pass on before the ark of the Lord your God into the midst of the Jordan, and take up each of you a stone upon his shoulder, according to the number of the tribes of the people of Israel, that this may be a sign among you. When your children ask in time to come, what do these stones mean to you? Then you shall tell them that the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of the Lord, when it passed over the Jordan. The waters of the Jordan were cut off, so these stones shall be to the people of Israel a memorial forever.'" And so he has that whole point of it here. It's to be memorial forever for your generations, when your children, your grandchildren, generations beyond that ask what happened here. You remind them of this very pivotal event in your history. Just as back in the time of Moses, 19 times God said, remember this covenant, remember what I've told you. The idea of remembering your past, remembering what God has done, but in some cases, remembering their mistakes so that they could learn from them. And so I realized in that, the first time I heard a teaching on this, I thought, well, what are my standing stones? What are our standing stones? They may not be physical objects, but sometimes they might be. For me, one of my standing stones is my wedding ring. It's a physical reminder of a covenant that I've committed myself to. Okay? And as I said once before, I don't need this to remind me of that covenant, but it's there anyway, okay, because my covenant is right here with me. But that is an example of a standing stone, in a sense. Other things like our baptism is a time, a very specific time in our walk with God, and we made a public declaration that we belong to the Lord. Things like communion that we do every so often. That is, in a sense, a memorial reminding us of the whole point of our faith, bringing us back to that. What are our standing stones? What are your standing stones? You think of it being, maybe key people in your life, key times in your life, a key event, a key location, something very special that God has given you as a reference point in your journey with Him. And one of the things that reflecting on those events, remembering those times, those places, those people does, is it gives us encouragement when we're facing the next difficulty. Because we have a memorial that, hey, God parted the Red Sea for me back here. He parted the Jordan River, whatever it would be. So I want to share with you some of my standing stones, those pivotal moments, those pivotal people that I've had in my life. And maybe kind of jog your memory as you hear mine, might help remind you of some of the ones that you've had. For me, of course, my family is a big one. I was born in a Christian family, and I'm very thankful for that heritage. My first memory, we were talking about this with my son Elias some time ago, my earliest memory is when I was 11 months old. Not many kids remember something that young, but I had fresh off the pot boiling coffee spilled on my shoulder. I spilled it on my own shoulder, but I actually remember that. It was such a traumatic event. So my first memory of life is a traumatic one. Don't remember anything else until I was probably 3 years old. But also January 1979, January 14th, 1979, that was the day I gave my life to the Lord. That's a very pivotal day in my journey. I have those special times like that, but I also have difficult times that served as a testimony to God's faithfulness. When I was 11 years old, I remember I got lost in the woods while I was on a family vacation. And it was getting dark, and I knew the thing my parents had told me, if you get lost, stay put. But I kind of reasoned, well, if I stay put for another 20 minutes, they're not going to be able to find me because it's going to be pitch black out here. And I had no idea which way to go. And I remember praying, asking the Lord what I should do, and I had the strong sense of turn around and walk in the opposite direction. And so I took that risk. I walked in the opposite direction, and about 50 yards, I pulled some bushes aside, and there was a parking lot. Okay? That's a standing stone for me because that was one of the first times I remember sort of the reality of what I knew in my head, but the reality was that God is real and He speaks. And He just spoke to me in a way I hadn't recognized before. Okay? My baptism was one of those. Some years later, I had a couple of physical accidents, both involving my brother, interestingly. One time we were playing softball. I was a pitcher, he was the batter, and he was really good at hitting home runs. And he hit a home run type ball, but it hit me square in the face. Very traumatic for me. But I remember that time because I was clinging so close to the Lord because I had the sense of I'm completely helpless. A couple years later, I was messing around with him, and I don't know why I was doing this, but I was standing on his shoulders, and we'd walk around the house and look in a second-story window and scare my mom while she's washing the dishes. It was fun. But I fell off his shoulders and snapped my arm, broke my arm. And I remember at that moment, all I could do was call out to God. And the way He comforted me and calmed my fears in the midst of what to me was a very traumatic event, I'll never forget that. Right? Things like that along the year, among the years that I was following Him. When I graduated from high school, went to Youth of the Mission, and I remember there were specific places where God spoke to me about my future. A certain place, I was in the middle of the Pacific Islands on an outreach. And I remember where I was in the nation of Guam at a certain cliff, and I felt like God was calling me to go do this type of thing long term. I'll never forget that. Once I came back to YWAM, just for a short-term thing, I remember, praying about whether I should go back, and God gave me a number of confirmations, things that I wrote down. And when I began to doubt my calling to go into YWAM, I would look back on those things and realize, no, He called me here. He called me here. He hasn't changed His mind. I'm going to keep going. I remember one specific instance where this was a time when I was serving there with Tom and Debbie. This ministry is going through a lot of difficulties, and this couple actually kind of helped get me through it. But there was a lot of good things happening there. There was a lot of good people at this ministry, but there were also other people who were making very bad choices. And it made this setting a very turbulent time, a very turbulent place. And I somehow ended up in leadership, in a leadership team during this turbulent time. And it really began to take a toll on me. And I remember there was one particular, I think it was at Christmas time, I went home just for about 2 weeks to visit family. And that time I was back in Minnesota with my family, it was like an oasis. There was no stress. There was no wondering what's happening here. There was no manipulations happening. I just felt, peace, safety, acceptance. I was able to truly relax physically and spiritually during this brief period of time at home. I remember going to the airport. My dad drove me to the airport to drop me off. And I began to switch gears in my heart and mind, and I began to contemplate going back to Hawaii, going back to this very difficult season, going back to this turbulent place, because I knew nothing had changed while I was away. And a thought came to me. I don't have to get on that plane. I could stay here in this place of peace. I could stay in this place of comfort. And I began to entertain that seriously. I thought, this would be radical. I don't usually do radical things, but this would, I could just simply not get on that plane, call my family up and tell them to come pick me up. And I remember sitting in the waiting area, and they're beginning to call up the different rows. And I thought, I can still change my mind. And I began to seek the Lord on it. And I didn't get any sense that He was releasing me from the path He had me on. And I began to really get distraught. I remember thinking, I can't do this. But I remember standing up, and I began to go forward. And as I got down, gave the ticket to the ticket agent. I'm weeping, and she's like, "What is wrong with this young man? He's weeping, he's crying because he's not going to see his dad, whatever it is." But I remember I thought, no, by God's grace, I'm going to choose to obey. I remember looking down the jetway, and I thought, it's still not too late to turn back. But I began to step forward, and every step I took in the direction what God had told me to, it was like every step I felt a little bit of the weight lift. By the time I got in the plane, I had a sense of anticipation and excitement about what God was going to do, even though I hadn't seen Him working yet, to my liking. Okay? That is a pivotal standing stone for me, because anytime now I go to board a plane, I see jetway, I'm reminded of how God used the symbol of a jetway as basically this tunnel of obedience. Am I going to trust Him in the midst of circumstances, in the midst of things that don't make sense to me? That's a standing stone for me. I think of other times, like I could share one after another, but I think you get the point. We all have these things. For me, my marriage was a very significant turning point. The birth of my firstborn son, the birth of my second son, some of the happiest moments of my life, and also those traumatic ones, as I mentioned. We all have those. And what I'd like to do is just, as I'm thinking about this, as I'm sharing this, you may have some of your own coming to mind. Now, I'm not one of these type of people who likes to journal. Some people do that a lot. That's not how I'm naturally bent. But I have to tell you, when I have key events, I journal about them a little bit. And there's been so many times God has brought me back to when I'm having these doubts about maybe the path He has me on or the things that I'm enduring. I look back and I'm like, no, look at this. This journal is a testimony of God's faithfulness. And what that does is that inspires me for the next challenge, that if God was faithful all these other times, even when it didn't go the way I wanted to, but He was faithful in His timing and to His reckoning, He's with me now in this one, and He'll be with me the next. A real key one, which I was going to skip, I feel like I'm supposed to bring this up right now. But it was after I'd been on what I would call a 9-month spiritual high, where everything was amazing, right? My quiet times with the Lord, I felt His presence. I would go to church, and whatever the pastor was talking about, it was like the Word was coming to life. I was loving it. I had been in Wyoming for a season, and the time there was just fantastic. I always felt like the Lord was with me, even in the challenges. Worship times are amazing. Quiet times are amazing. I went for 9 months, and then it was like it all turned off in an instant. If I were to compare spiritual encounter or spiritual experience where you really feel like God's with you, the presence of the Lord. If I were to compare that to my life being a building, it's like God went down in the basement, found the breaker, the main thing, and shut it off and locked the box so that no power came at all. Felt nothing. And at first I thought, well, this is normal. This happens. People have this for a few hours at a time, maybe a few days, a few weeks. But I'll come out of it. But it didn't stop. It kept going month after month after month for probably a year and a half of complete spiritual dryness. I would go to that same church, same worship leader, same pastor. Felt nothing in worship. Didn't feel like anything was being illuminated to me through the message. I would read my scriptures. I tried to maintain a discipline, but nothing would be highlighted to me. It just seemed like words on a page. My prayer times felt like I was talking to a wall. And the discouragement got deeper and deeper with time. And I mentioned this to some people, and they would encourage me, and they'd say, well, Tom, every cloud has a silver lining. Or, there's always a light at the end of the tunnel. And I was thinking, it doesn't feel like a tunnel, it feels like a cul-de-sac. That's what it feels like, you know. And I'd heard the phrase, you know, about those light at the end of the tunnel. And I thought, no, everything's always darkest just before it goes totally black. And I think that's where I'm at right now. That was my perspective. I was getting very pessimistic. But I had one time where I had my Bible and I read it, felt nothing. And my prayer time turned into complaining to God. I was whining. I hope it's okay to whine to God. Is that okay? He accepts, yeah, okay. Whether right or wrong, I was whining to God about this whole season I'd been in. And I felt like that silence was broken very briefly. Go ahead. Oh, it's the only place I'm allowed to whine. Okay, to the Lord, respectfully. Yes, okay. So I was whining. I think I was doing it respectfully, but I was whining to the Lord, yes. Okay, so I was whining. I'm like, why, you know, this has been so long, and how come I can't hear you? And I felt like that silence was broken briefly, and I got really excited because I'm like, hey, this is what it's like to have that still small voice. It wasn't audible. It was sort of just the sense of these thoughts are his, not mine. And it came in the form of a few questions. And the first one was just very, you know, tell me how you're feeling. So I poured out my complaint. And the next question was basically something like this. Well, in the midst of all this turmoil that you're feeling, what do you believe about me and my nearness to you? And I thought about it, and I think it's in Hebrews 13. There's a verse that says, I will never leave you or forsake you. And I says, well, God, I believe that you're here with me. I believe that you're here with me. And the next question was, well, if you don't feel me, then why do you believe that I'm there with you? I said, well, because in your word, you promised that you'd never leave me or forsake me. The next question was this. Well, if you believe that I'm with you, and you believe it because I promised you, then what's your problem? And silence again. I was waiting for more, there was no more. Okay? That's a standing stone for me, because I realized at that point, God was trying to tell me that although we have encounters, we have experience, and we have times where we sense his presence, he's true even when we don't. And for me, that was a very important point in life, because I have those times where I'm on the mountaintop, and I have those times in the valley. And when I'm in the valley, I realize that he is no less faithful than when I experienced him on the mountaintop. Okay? Those kinds of things have been so significant. Okay? And of course, all these things, you know, recognizing how they are just simply an expression of what he's already promised us in the Word. And so the question I have for all of us this morning, what are your standing stones? What are those key events, those key places, those significant people, those special times, either of mountaintop experiences or God being faithful in the valley? What are those for you? And I would encourage you during this week to take some time, reflect on those, especially if you're going through a crisis right now. Reflect on his goodness in the past. Be reminded of his goodness, of the standing stones that he's had with you on your journey, and use that as a platform to once again declare your trust with the next thing, with this current struggle, this current opposition, whatever it would be. Something else is added in the book of 1 Peter. A lot of these ideas, even the introduction of the standing stones I got, as I mentioned, from a pastor named Ray Vonderlaan from Michigan. He also made a connection which I would never have put together myself. But he thinks that Peter is making reference to the standing stone idea in his letter when he's talking about us as believers being living stones. And here's a passage from 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 4 through 5. He says, as you come to him, and of course he's addressing the believers, the people he's discipling, as you come to him, a living stone rejected by men, but in the sight of God chosen and precious, you yourselves, like living stones, are being built up as a spiritual house, to be a holy priesthood, to offer spiritual sacrifices acceptable to God through Jesus Christ. And a little later on, he encourages them to keep their conduct among the non-believers honorable. And his point was that we have our standing stones in our life, but we ourselves are meant to be living stones, where the way we live our lives, the way people see us going through our struggles with God's grace, becomes a testimony to them of who God is. And just as the children after Joshua look at this pile of stones and says, what's this pile of stones all about? We can be a living testament, and people can see our lives and say, what's happening there? How come you're going through this difficulty with a sense of peace and joy. And that is an opportunity to direct everything, every time, back to Him. And so, whatever it is you're facing now, meditate on God's character, meditate on His promises, meditate on those times that He has been faithful to you in the past. And so I just want to close in a prayer and ask the Lord to remind us whatever those need to be for us individually. And so, Jesus, I thank you for your faithfulness to all of us. Lord, we all have unique journeys with you, but we all know you, the same God. I thank you that you speak to us and you relate to us and that you're faithful to us in so many ways. Even when we don't recognize it or give you the credit, you're faithful. I pray that you would remind us of what our standing stones are. Use those things to give us encouragement for the next trial that we face, the next season of difficulty. I pray that we would take those mountaintop experiences and write them down and remember them. And Lord, anything that would obstruct us from remembering your goodness, remembering your faithfulness in the past, I pray you would clear that out of the way. Thank you, Lord. Amen. Amen.